Hi there and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the football podcast that takes you inside the boardroom with me, Adrian Goldberg. I'm an investigative journalist, West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, joined as usual by Charlie Methven, Managing Director of Mount Pleasant FC in Jamaica. Charlie is a former director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic, has been an advisor to both Spurs and Arsenal, and was a boyhood Oxford United fan. This time, as Newcastle United hunt for a sporting director for the second time in less than a year following the announcement of Paul Mitchell's departure. What does a sporting director actually do, and how important are they? How do you manage potential conflicts with the head coach? There have been suggestions that Mitchell didn't see eye to eye with Eddie Howe at St James's and had been critical of a recruitment policy which, in his view, was not sufficiently data-driven. Later as well, we'll talk about Premier League finances. The excellent Swiss Ramble Substack has identified that top-flight clubs collectively lost £164 million last year. Why does big-time football, with all that broadcasting revenue, all that income through the gate, find it so hard to break even? We'll talk about that a little bit later. But we were on a similar theme this week, Charlie. You and I met up at the Fair Game Conference at AFC Wimbledon, organised by Niall Cooper. He's a man dedicated to trying to get some kind of financial sense into football, and you hot-footed it over from Heathrow Airport on your way back from Jamaica. And it was a really good conference, wasn't it? Really positive. Lots of people trying to find solutions to football's endemic financial crises.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great conference. It brings together a disparate group of people within football who, for various different reasons, have these concerns at the front of their minds. And you discuss in detail some matters that just are just not sexy enough to be in the media in any detail a lot of the time. I think if I was to be sort of critical, I would say it's a pity that some of the games higher ups don't turn up. I'd like to see the head of the Football League there. I'd like to see someone from the Premier League there, because it's only an afternoon or two, and it's one of the very, very few places where these things do get discussed in detail, and it's in London. It's easy to get to for most people, but it seems to me like, as we'll probably go and discuss later on, that for those in charge of the game, sustainability and fairness are all something to be discussed another day, something that perhaps happens after I've left my job and some other guy takes over, whatever it might be. The can gets kicked down the road, and in some cases it edges ever closer to the edge, sort of to the onrushing traffic. So it was a really good day. I wasn't able to make the second day, but I did read some notes from it, and it covered a lot of the topics that we cover weekly on this podcast. So yeah, it was really good. I commend Niall for his efforts. I don't agree with Fair Game on everything. My particular bone of contention is that they focus on trying to get more money going into the non-league, which I think is a mistake, because I think that even our 92 game professional pyramid it is great and it's wonderful, and we have it for historic reasons, but it's arguably too big in terms of spreading the what money we do have, spreading it around. I think if you start going from 92 professional clubs to sort of 110, 120, because that's what will happen if more money goes into non-league, more of them will turn pro. That's what will happen. And you end up with a situation where you get even more unsustainable clubs because of the money being spread thinner and thinner and further down the pyramid, where really there aren't that many people who are really turning up. So that's my one bone of contention with Fair Game. But other than that, all of their other aims and missions I find laudable.
Yeah, well done to Niall Cooper for organising that, and I'm sure it's not for any want of effort on his part that you don't see those movers and shakers at the very top of the game appearing, but it does bring together executives like yourself, journalists like myself, fan representatives as well, supporters, trusts and so on. It is a very, very good gathering. So do check out the Fair Game website if you're not aware of their activities. And we will come back, as I say, to the finances of the Premier League before the end of this episode. But I just want to talk, Charlie, about the importance of a sporting director. And of course, a sporting director's role may vary slightly from club to club, but Newcastle United have lost Paul Mitchell. Mitchell himself had been critical of the club's recruitment policy just a few months ago. He's now decided to leave because the club's managing director, because the club's CEO, Darren Eales, with whom he was very close, has had to leave the club. Darren Eales has got an illness, which is forcing him to take some time out to recuperate. So Mitchell has gone. But talk to me about the role of a sporting director. Does the sporting director dictate who a club signs? What role do they have in the fitness of players at a club and overseeing the medical department, for example?
Well, I mean, that's pretty much exactly right. Now, the important thing to understand is that historically in English football, but not really in European football, not going back a long, long way, the way in which things were organised was that you had a club manager, football manager, and then you had the board. Now, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, the manager wasn't really often a coach. The manager was more like a general manager, was normally a former professional footballer, but actually took on some of the functions that pertained to a modern sporting director. And that person would then have underneath them a fitness trainer and a couple of coaches and a head scout, right? And in many ways, this was how Fergie organised Man United. Fergie never did the coaching. He always had high-level coaches who would come in and coach the side, you know, Carlos Queiroz and Steve McLaren and all these types of people who were managers, effectively sort of head coaches in their own right at other points in their career. And Fergie would sit in his office at the training ground, overseeing all these other different things, the academy, recruitment, performance, fitness, managing up to the board, and being the media front of the whole thing. And then as far as the team were concerned, yeah, he would have meetings with individual players. He would look on at some training sessions to see what was going on, and he would then go back into his office and speak to an agent about something, whatever it might be. So he was very much the old school manager as English football used to have it. Now, as things went on, the manager became more like a head coach. So the person who was actually on the pitch doing the work every single day, etc. And that is a phenomenally time-consuming job. It's not just about the 2 or 3 hours you spend out on the training pitch. It's also about the preparation for those sessions, which is something that a lot of fans won't see, which is that coaches spend a lot of time preparing in detail for the sessions and then debriefing after the sessions. So for a 2-hour coaching session will be at least 5 hours in total of pre-prep and debrief, right? So in a 10-hour working day, a head coach will be spending at least 5 hours of that focused in and around that one training session. There will then be individual meetings and individual coaching sessions with players. There'll be what we call clipped up stuff from the previous week's game, which individual players will be taken through with the head coach and with other coaches. This is what you could have done better. This is what we want to see you work on, etc., etc. So being the head coach is a full-time role in its own right. And effectively within, first of all, European football, and then in English football, is what effectively replaced the role of the manager. It was no longer deemed to be reasonable for the manager, who did bear responsibility for the first team performance, not to be the person who coached the team. So whilst there are still a few head coaches or managers who don't do all the coaching, the vast majority of them these days are head coaches. And Eddie Howe is very much a tracksuit head coach, right? He is a head coach. That's what he does. Now, that person does not have time to watch other football matches much. They will watch next week's opponents. They will watch, maybe once it's put in front of them on a plate by the recruitment team, they will watch some clips of players who are options for signing for the head coach to determine which of those options he might be more keen on or less keen on. But what he does not have time to is travel around the country with his little black book, like used to be the case 30, 40 years ago with managers, looking at other teams' games, noting players. And in those days, the player pool that they were selecting from was much, much smaller. So let's say that you were a top division manager in the 1980s, you were El Tel or you were Big Ron or whatever it might be. And you would leave the coaching to your head coach, and you would get in your car and you go off and watch a second division game, championship these days, to see whether there are any players coming up the ladder who you might want to sign. And you might have been alerted to a particular player by the chief scout, but it was very much your role to then go and watch that player and make a recommendation directly to the board. And the manager held the relationship with the board. So as I said, as the evolution went into more continental direction, and the manager morphed into the head coach, and the head coach became an all-encompassing coaching role, that created a gap between the head coach and the board, between the head coach and the chief scout, between the head coach and the head of performance, etc. And that is the role which on the continent first, and then subsequently in our country, has been filled by the sporting director, the director of football, the technical director, whatever you might want to call them. And there are various small nuances between these things, but in truth, it's very much a matter of different titles for different clubs. That is that big hole in the club set there. Now, there's just one last thing I want to throw on the table before handing back to you, Adrian, is about stability and strategy. Now, the head coach's future is determined by the performance of the first team, and for all the rights and wrongs of the matter, the truth is their average job tenure is 15 months, right? So they are not temperamentally likely to themselves set out a strategy for the long term, because being logical, smart people, they recognize that they're probably going to be there for between 1 and 3 years, 1 and 4 years at the most, really, 1 and 5 years at the very, very outside if they're super successful, but nobody else bigger comes in for them, right? That's the sort of. So if you're a board and you're trying to set a strategy for the medium term, you want to employ somebody who's going to be there for the medium term and views themselves as being there for the medium term, and whose success is not to be judged over a small number of games, but over the sort of trajectory of the club in the medium term. After our second year at Sunderland, we appointed a guy called Christian Speakman as director of football, and he'd been the Birmingham City Academy boss who had brought Bellingham through. And basically, we determined that, rather than keeping on signing more and more journeymen who couldn't cope with playing in front of the Sunderland crowd, we needed to go in a different route. We needed to have a proper strategy to sign players with a level of skill and ability who would be able to stand up to the pressure of playing at the Stadium of Light on a regular basis. So Christian was recruited as somebody who understood young players, understood performance trajectories of young players, had a thorough understanding of that landscape, and who would be there for a long time. Now, during Christian's 4-year tenure since then, I think there have been 4 managers, right? Four head coaches, whatever you might want to call it. Now, if the club had simply said had not had Christian, and had simply said every time that there's a new head coach, that head coach is going to come in and set the strategy, set the direction of travel, you'd end up with the club heading in lots of different directions all the time, right? So, because each manager or each head coach, or whatever, would come up with a slightly different idea about what the club should be doing or the direction the club should be headed in, etc. So it just doesn't work. So to my mind, it is an absolutely critical position, a really, really important, whatever the title might be, it's a really important decision. And there's one last thing, sorry, Adrian, just to toss you, one last thing, which is the relationship with the board. Now, the problem between the head coach and the directors of the club is that the gap in football knowledge between the directors of the club and the head coach is very substantial. Very, very substantial. And the gap in business understanding between the board and the head coach is also very substantial. The head coach has got no business experience, and the board has no professional hands-on football experience. So there tends to end up being some mutual incomprehension about what the other one's specialist topic is, despite the fact that both of the specialist topics affect the other one so heavily. So you can end up with some rather awkward moments, really, and situations where it's difficult for either side really to challenge the other side, because they don't really know enough. So they either challenge ignorantly or challenge not at all. What the sporting director is able to do is someone with a bit more business experience, someone with a bit more understanding of how the economics of the situation work, but also with hands-on football experience, and therefore able to challenge the manager. That's the theory.
In Newcastle's case, it would seem to me, and I've got no intimate first-hand knowledge of this, just reading around it, that Eddie Howe perhaps has a slightly more hands-on involvement in player recruitment than might normally be expected
Well,
at an
well,
elite club. Just to
but
say that
they've
Paul Mitchell had been critical of the failure of the club to sign Mark Guehi just before he arrived at the club. Newcastle's, and he was also critical of what he said was the club's lack of a data-driven approach to recruitment. But if you look at the recruitment record at Newcastle United over recent times, Bruno Guimaraes, Alexander Isak, Nick Pope, Sandro Tonali, Anthony Gordon, and their subsequent Carabao Cup success in the season just gone, they've done pretty well, haven't they?
Well, first of all, Newcastle basically haven't signed anyone for the last 2 or 3 windows. And the reason for that is that they'd ended up in an unstrategic mess where they'd oversigned players. And don't forget that those transfer payments keep on going for subsequent windows to the club you bought the player from. And they ended up last summer having to do the thing that no club should have to do, which have to sell their best young talent to balance their PSR, their profit and sustainability situation. Otherwise, they were going to get a points deduction. So Mitchell was undiplomatic when he called their recruitment policy not fit for purpose, but he was absolutely correct. He was absolutely correct. When you end up in a situation where you have to fire sell your best young players just to try and avoid a points deduction, then clearly that has been a strategic mess. And that is what happens when a manager or a head coach is too close to the whole thing, because they just don't understand PSR and that type of stuff. All they're interested in is, if I don't get better players in now and we don't win enough games in the next 3 or 4 months, I'm not even going to be here for a points deduction. I'm not even going to be here. There's no point. Like, I just want better players. I need it. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my job, and then my career is going to take a dive. I might not get such a good job again, etc., etc. Managers think very, very, very short term, and they would be irrational.
That's why, Charlie, you need in modern football that separation then between the person coaching the team, or perhaps overseeing the coaching, and the person picking the team, and the person then who is answerable to the board for the broader football strategy of the club. This came to a head at my club, West Brom, probably 25 years ago. It sounds like a long time if you're a younger listener to this podcast, but it was absolutely critical in the development of the club. And I've written about this in my forthcoming book, Where's the Money Gone? Because we had a fantastic manager, Gary Megson, who almost single-handedly turned the club around, and is still absolutely revered by supporters who knew the mess that the club was in at the time. But the recruitment policy at Gary Megson's time, when we were at the level we are now in the second division in the Championship, was essentially Gary Megson, his dad, Don, who had been a very good professional footballer at Sheffield Wednesday and Everton, and Bobby Hope, who was West Brom's then head of recruitment. And we had a chairman who came in, Paul Thompson, who had previously invested in the club, but the money had been spent under the aegis of another chairman, and the money raised had all been frittered away, been spent on players who just were not good enough. So Paul Thompson said, look, we've got to have a more scientific approach to this. We've got to analyse the players we're recruiting much better. And when the manager leaves, and as you've said, that's a fairly inevitable process at any football club, we need to ensure that the infrastructure of the club doesn't go with him. You know, that when Gary Megson left, then Don Megson would go as well, and his coach Frank Burrows would go with him. So you need to have an infrastructure that is there at the club week in, week out, year in, year out, and will stay there regardless of who the head coach is. That also comes with it, doesn't it? Kind of the club needs to steer what kind of players you're signing and what your bigger strategy is, because there's no point signing players who are, I don't know, fit for a Tony Pulis style of football, knock it long, big man up front, or a Sean Dyche kind of football, if your next manager is going to be Pep Guardiola.
All of the above. I'm not going to sort of labour your points, because that's all exactly right. Now, obviously I left Charlton a few weeks ago. Probably that was the most functional situation I've seen, where you've got a mature manager who does understand which way round the world goes, and Nathan Jones, who had senior relationships with sporting director or the managing director, brackets football or whatever you might call, plus the performance director, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Right. And then those three would then come to a board meeting and jointly present the football strategy between them, having thrashed it out, behind the scenes, etc. Off the back of that, a list of players in each position who fitted that strategy would be presented with the financial implications of all. That's when myself and the finance director would get involved in terms of, does that fit within the budget, asking questions and challenges around, what the rationale was behind certain players being on the list, etc. But never saying we should sign this player or we should sign that player, but the board just being able to challenge in a respectful environment the whole thing, and then decisions being made around the table with the manager present around what it is that was going to happen. Now, what the fans think, because fans are always 20 years behind reality when it comes to what's happening in football, is they go, well, we want the manager to be in charge of signings, right? Until the manager ends up not being good enough, and then they say, well, fire the manager. At which point you're left with all the manager's signings, and the new manager doesn't want those signings. So that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And it ends up with clubs having long tails of players who have been assembled by different failed managers in different ways and different systems, etc. There has to be some sense of, in our case, what under our tenure, what does a Charlton player look like, right? What does that mean? What does it mean to be a Charlton player? And the strategy was derived from an analysis, really. It's an academy club, it being unusual and having a top 10 rated academy, but while being in League One. So Charlton is always going to be using a lot of players from its academy. Those players are very often, most often, African Caribbean origin players who tend to have pace and power as their defining characteristics. That tends to be the case. So therefore, a playing style that doesn't work within the pace and power that you're producing out of your academy isn't going to work. So therefore, you need a manager who likes to play with pace and power and intensity and that kind of stuff, because that's going to suit the players in your academy. And that starts to define what senior players you bring in from the outside as well. So that's how it should work. The whole thing should be joined up from an original thought about what the style we're going to play and the reason behind the style we're going to play, fed throughout the entire system with a manager appointed who likes playing that style of football, who then agrees that there's a strategy of recruitment on what we call certain attributes. So the manager will say, under the system that I'm going to play, my left back needs to be able to run X amount of kilometres a game, or my left back needs to be able to deliver a certain amount of crosses per game, because that's what I'm asking him to do. What the manager will determine those attributes within what he calls game model. So that's the sort of detailed layout of what he wants to achieve in the game. Now, the next bit is the performance director. And this is an increasingly important role within football. Again, football being very late to the party. American sports, that person has been one of the most important and highly paid people in any American sport set up for a long, long time. For the simple observation that you can have a great manager or head coach, you can have great recruitment and great players, but if they're not fit and available to train and play, then it doesn't really matter a damn, right? So when we came into Charlton, one of the things that we noticed was that Charlton had the lowest availability record in the league. In other words, they had the highest number of training days and games during which a certain amount of players were unavailable to train or to play, right? So effectively what we did was we sought to get ourselves the best performance director possible. So this is the person who's in charge of the medical department, the physio department, the fitness department, all those types of things, right? So we ended up poaching the number 2 from Brighton, who was a very smart guy called Dr. Will Abbott. And Will came in and told us it was unwelcome, but this is why you need expertise. That our training pitches, the drainage underneath them had collapsed, and that there was an uneven texture to the ground, softer in some areas, harder in some areas. This was putting great strain on players' calves and hamstring muscles, and this was causing them stress, which meant that they then broke down in games because their calves and hamstrings had done too much work on the training pitches. So we had to dig up all the training pitches and relay all the drainage, and that was a £500,000 expense.
Wow!
But without
so that was he identified that as a cause of injuries that were impacting first team performance.
Correct.
Wow!
And we then have the highest availability in the league this season.
Wow! And
Nathan,
go on, sorry.
Nathan was able to. There was During the second half of this season, Charlton accrued the most points of any club in League One.
I think you've
more than
mentioned that
Birmingham.
before, Charlie.
Yeah. And the reason for that was that Nathan was able to play the same first team, I think, for something like 15 games in a row. He was able to play the same players, put out the same players week after week after week after week after week, etc. And that is owing to both recruiting players who are durable, but also then having a performance regime that is able to keep them available. And what is important there is the relationship between the performance director, the sporting director, and the manager, because there are going to be days when the performance director says, on my analysis, if you give this player a full training session today, he'll break down or he won't be able to play on Saturday. So we need to pull him out of training. Now, the head coach never likes that. The head coach doesn't like to hear that because they want to get their full team on the training pitch to drill what they need to be able to drill. But if it means that player then becomes unavailable for the next month, it doesn't avail of anyone much use. So these are a complex web of relationships within the club. You've got the board, you've got the sporting director, you've got the performance director, you've got the head coach. And the functionality of those relationships is what determines whether a club is going to be successful or not. The fans just look at it and say, well, we've either got a good manager or a bad manager. But the truth of the matter is that the setup around it and the structure around it and the consistency around it is what determines whether a manager looks like a good manager or looks like a bad manager.
No, well, just to underline your point there about the importance of the medical side and conditioning, and that is a real insight, Charlie. I suspect most fans wouldn't have about how fitness works and can work at a football club. Paul Mitchell at Newcastle United appointed under him a guy called James Bunce, with whom he had worked at Monaco to deal with fitness and conditioning. And I'm taking this from the Newcastle Chronicle. They say that Newcastle United had one of the best injury records in the Premier League this season, following a dramatic turnaround. So Newcastle lost 779 days to injury. Sounds like a lot. That was actually the fourth best in the Premier League, whereas the previous season they'd lost, this is the collective numbers of days that players were injured. The previous season they'd lost 1,950 days to injury. So they've more than halved the number of days lost to injury of players in their squad. And obviously, as you say, if the players are unfit, it doesn't matter how good they are, they can't be doing a job for the team. So that side of it, and that unseen, almost invisible side of it to the fan in the stands, is clearly of huge importance.
It's of huge importance. And it's not just the days that they are unavailable. It's the fact that when they then become back available, there are two problems. First of all, it takes them a while to get match fit again, but you have to play them, otherwise they can't get match fit by definition. So you then have an underperformance within your team during that period. And secondly, it makes them much more liable to break down with either the same injury or another injury because they aren't match fit. So it's a horrible knock-on effect. And I've been inside clubs, Charlton, when we arrived at Charlton, and Oxford going back away, when this area was not right, and it's utterly debilitating. It is absolutely destructive to everything you're trying to do. Just when the set piece coach thinks that he's nailed a few corner routines, a key person within that corner routine or two of them go out for a few weeks, and then somebody else comes in who doesn't necessarily have the same ability to deliver the same ball, or who isn't necessarily as good as blocking the goalkeeper, whatever it might be. Every single element of what you do becomes unpicked and debilitated once you do not have players available. So I'd be looking at Newcastle's current situation with concern, if I'm being honest with you. That this is my conclusion, which is the point about the sporting directors, you need stability, right? They've obviously lost Dan Ashworth to Man United, Dan having only been there for a year or so. They've now lost Paul Mitchell having only been there a year or so. And what will be happening is they'll be accumulating behind the scenes various groups of people who came in either with Ashworth or with Mitchell, or now, if Eddie's more in charge, more with Eddie, whatever it might be. And it doesn't work. It's really, really difficult to grow a spirit and a collective will within a group when they've come in under different people with different ideas and different strategies and all this type of stuff. So, you know, if Bunce is a great performance guy, that's great, but he's he came into the club under the premise that he would be working for Paul Mitchell, and that relationship of trust might not be there with whoever else has come in. I will add one other point, is that performance directors need to have a sporting director around, because the sporting director protects them from the manager. The manager, again, is driven by the short term. The manager will say, I want that player on the pitch. He is my player. Get him on the bloody pitch, right? And sometimes the sporting director has to step in and say, look, I know why you want that player on the pitch, but as a sporting director, I'm withdrawing him from training. He's not going to be on the pitch. Now, if you just leave that to a relationship between the performance director and the manager, very often the manager will Bigfoot the performance director and will simply insist that player is training or that player is playing. And that's when the problems start to occur. Again, the clash between the short term and the medium to long term. So I'd be concerned. I would be concerned about Newcastle running a club these days, which is in the Champions League, which has all these various different things going on. So you're dealing with a travelling schedule as well. Your recruitment becomes very, very complex because of all the moving pieces within the UEFA cost control regulations and the Premier League cost control regulations, and all the sort of long tail of stuff that you're still paying off from previous regimes, all this type of stuff. So at the moment, all the fans will be going, this is brilliant. We want Eddie in charge of everything, right? Modern football history relates that doesn't work. That the head coach being in charge of everything in a football club does not work. And I know fans love to think back to the old days of Brian Clough, etc. It was different for all sorts of different reasons, but it was different.
I mean, to be fair, there will be another sporting director at Newcastle United. I don't think the suggestion is that Eddie Howe will be it, but I note with interest that the recruitment process will involve the club's current head of recruitment, Steve Nixon, who I guess is the modern equivalent of a chief scout, plus, I suppose, but also Andy Howe, who is Eddie Howe's nephew, who is the assistant head of recruitment. Now, I'm not in any way denigrating the professionalism of Andy Howe. I'm sure does a fantastic job. And as I've reflected in the podcast already, Newcastle have been very successful in their recruitment in one respect, in that they've achieved success on the field. But I've got to say, when I look at football clubs and I see family members being in senior positions related to other family members in senior positions, it always makes me question. You just wonder, is that what influences, what pressures can be brought to bear on that person? That's just human nature, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's also very strange to have people who will be the sporting director's underlings choosing the sporting director, right? So Steve Nixon will be reporting into the sporting director, and what you want is the board to determine who the best sporting director would be to oversee Steve Nixon. If Steve Nixon is telling the board, this is the person I want to be my boss, that is profoundly dysfunctional. So I just look at the whole situation and think, actually, what this smacks of is that Eddie has persuaded the powers that be that he should be in charge of everything, which is something that all managers want, or they think they want. But actually, they're best off not having it for their own sake. They're best off not having it. Because they're insecure naturally because of their job tenures. They think, well, if I could control the entire situation, that will make me more secure. But actually, the thing that makes a manager more secure is good results. And good results are achieved within a framework of having a sporting director and of the whole thing being in a more professional sort of modern way. So counterintuitively, part of the board's job is to persuade the head coach that he himself will be better off with high quality people overseeing him.
Great stuff. Charlie, briefly, before we go, let's just reflect on this astonishing figure to me, astonishing that the scale of losses in the Premier League, though it is significantly less than it was a few years ago, according to the Swiss Ramble Substack, which I do recommend to people, Premier League clubs collectively lost £164 million last year. Now, that is much better than the 709 million they lost in the 2018-19 season. But even so, how can a sport which generates so much money still end up losing so much money?
Well, you have to go back over the last 2 years of our podcast to sort of really get to grips with why that is the case. But I will note a massive downward trend here. 160 million collective losses between 20 clubs is less than 10 million on average per club. Now, when you're thinking about average revenues of 300 million, it's within the margin of error of break even, right? What you're saying is basically is that most Premier League clubs average revenues 200, call it 250 million, average cost 260 million. Like that is, I know that is very close to break even, and that is the result of all sorts of tightening ups of cost control measures, of UEFA's cost control regulations coming in, and of the Premier League getting so rich that its clubs don't need to overspend in order to get the best players out in advance of the European clubs who are the competition in this regard.
Yeah, although, of course, an average does mean that some clubs will have made a profit, or some clubs will only have lost a couple of million. Other clubs lost significant sums. Manchester United, 131 million.
Yeah,
Aston Villa,
that's exactly right, Adrian.
Bournemouth, 66.
So that's exactly right. I mean, basically, per our discussion last week about Man United, and knowing that Man United lost 130 million and the entire league lost 160 million, you might as well say Man United lost 150 odd million, and the rest of the league between them on average broke even, right? That is the truth of the matter. That is what has happened here. There are ups and downs within that, as you would have in any industry. But I see this as a good direction of travel, and the good basis and the good starting point for the more constructive discussion about financial distribution between the Premier League and the Football League, because the Premier League has got itself into a place where it is functionally break even, leaving aside Man United for a moment. The rest of it is functionally break even and still outspends the top European leagues by a factor of double, right? So when it comes to those discussions with the football regulator, it should be relatively straightforward to say to them, guys, look, you can easily push down some more money here. You're break even and spending much more than your European opponents anyway, and winning lots of European trophies.
Great stuff as always, Charlie. Thank you very much indeed. Charlie Methven, Managing Director of Mount Pleasant FC in Jamaica. I'm Adrian Goldberg. My book, Where's the Money Gone?, is currently at the proofreaders. That's exciting.
Whoa! Wow!
Yeah. So we may have it out by July. Who knows? I don't want to promise too much. But in the meantime, you can follow me at adriangoldberg.substack.com, where a few snippets leak out now and again. And I just want to place on record my thanks to Jed Thomas for his production assistance with this episode, and Mark Machado at 1129 Media for his work putting us up on YouTube and his work on our socials and so on. If you do follow us on YouTube, do, as they say, smash that subscribe button. And if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please follow us there too and leave us a review. Best of all, though, mention this podcast to a friend. Nothing works quite like a personal recommendation. We'll see you again next week. But for now, thanks very much. Cheers, Charlie. See you soon. Ciao.